My name is Russ Derry. I'm the Director of Education at Epilepsy Foundation of Michigan, so I'll be moderating this panel discussion. And let's start by just having each person introduce themselves briefly and kind of just describe your experience with epilepsy and this particular topic. Dr. Tank, can you go first?
Yeah, I'm Evan Tank. I'm an epileptologist at Spectrum Health. I deal with epilepsy every day at work, and I work exclusively with epilepsy patients as opposed to other general neurology patients. So day in, day out, I'm kind of confronted with a lot of the issues that we're going to discuss today, and it often requires, I guess, a little bit of creative thinking sometimes to help patients best manage some of the issues that we're going to talk about. So this is something that comes up for me very often in clinic and my day-to-day work. Okay,
great. Dr. Wolff?
So very similar. I don't see epilepsy every day, but started training in epilepsy on residencies and pre-doctoral residencies. And then it's been kind of specially niched throughout my practice as a neuropsychologist. And so seeing that fairly routinely. In terms of technology, I think we're all being forced, both as medical professionals, neuropsychologists, families, to look at how to use technology to optimize care and to optimize functioning as best as we can. So it's something that through the years, even being part of the Epilepsy Foundation, I think we've had these technology talks now for maybe 4 or 5 years as apps became more available, and now they're becoming more integrated. So I think we're all trying to keep on our toes and keep up with what can be usable.
Okay, great. Susan.
So I'm Susan Woolner, patient and caregiver support. I also deal with epilepsy every day. I'm not affected myself, but I do have a family member who's affected and have used technology to solve some challenges for them. And actually, I have 2 family members now, one much older and recently diagnosed. So one of the things that I've seen, just like Dr. Wolff said, is that technology all of a sudden is right in our faces because of the pandemic and what's going on now. So this is a really great time to be talking about it. I run a technology fund for us at Mercy Health that provides devices to people who otherwise might not be able to get them. So that's one thing that I think that we have that's unique. And I think that there's the apps and the development of those things are really changing now. And I expect to see a lot more, not just seizure detection things that people are looking for, but really lifestyle changes in order for them to adapt their lives to mitigate what may be a trigger for their epilepsy.
Okay. And lastly, Elizabeth, can you introduce yourself? You're muted right now. There we go.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Stout. I have had epilepsy for 9 years at this point, and currently I'm more at Albion College studying biology and music. And technology has made a big difference for me in working to control my epilepsy in many ways. Especially when I was going through difficult times, I would use it to record my seizures and more recently to make the transition towards adulthood and independence. Because sometimes it's hard being a young adult who can't drive and do other things that most everybody can due to my epilepsy, but I have learned that technology has a lot of benefits to help support me in finding ways to get around those difficulties.
Great, great. And we'll talk a lot more about all of these things today. So over the last 30 years or so, the role of technology in daily life has increased exponentially. The internet, smartphones, social media have all fundamentally changed the way we communicate and learn and organize our lives. And such technology has become even more instrumental during this current COVID-19 pandemic. In addition, seizure detection and alert devices, seizure tracking apps, and assistive technologies for cognition have empowered people with epilepsy to more effectively manage their condition and minimize its impact on quality of life. So let's start by talking about how home-based technologies can facilitate epilepsy diagnosis and improve seizure control. Dr. Tank, can you talk about some of the technologies you found most helpful in working with patients?
Yeah, so in speaking first about diagnosing epilepsy, far and away the most helpful thing that's kind of come into our grasp recently has been smartphone videos. When patients come in to see me in clinic, and I have to determine, whether or not these episodes that they're having are epileptic seizures or some other kind of phenomenon, it's as many of you realize, it's often difficult for the patients themselves to describe what it is that happens. As you're losing awareness during it, or who knows what. When patients are able to come with loved ones or with their own videos to show me what their seizure or their episode looks like, it not only helps me in getting some clinical insight into what it is and whether I think it's an epileptic seizure or some other sort of issue, but there are different signs, clinical signs that happen during seizures that may tell me what type of seizure it is, where in the brain it may be coming from. That helps us determine maybe what medications are or are not appropriate, what kind of maybe imaging studies we need to look at. So that is invaluable. In terms of not so much diagnosis, but seizure control, again, a lot of things recently have become available that are extremely helpful. The thing that, in my personal experience, has been the most helpful is using smartphones, again, to help patients with medication compliance. So many patients with epilepsy have just difficulties with memory and often forget to take their medications. And we know that in people with epilepsy, the most common reason to have breakthrough seizures is missing doses of medications. So whether it's just simply setting alarms or reminders on your phone to help you remember to take your medications, or using apps that help do a similar thing, that has also been extremely helpful in controlling seizures in many of my patients. So those are the two things that I think are the most helpful in my kind of day-to-day clinical experience.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of tracking apps, have you noticed that patients have been able, who use tracking apps, have been able to identify seizure patterns and seizure triggers more easily by using those apps? And like roughly what percentage of patients would you say use some sort of tracking app or even a low-tech version, just even a seizure diary or journal that's written?
Sure. I frequently encourage my patients to use logs, and many of them are good. In terms of a percentage, I'd say, unfortunately, probably less than 50%. Maybe it's my fault for not emphasizing it enough, but many of my patients do keep logs. A lot of them, like you said, are kind of low tech with just a notebook, and that's very helpful too. But I do, as a fairly routine habit in clinic, I'll put reminders kind of on our checkout paperwork at the end of an appointment to look into specific seizure apps. One that I really like is My Seizure Tracker, which helps you not only kind of classify your seizures, you can kind of fit them into different bins. This is this type of seizure, this type of seizure, but it also helps you keep a log of when they happened. And like you said, it can help you identify patterns. So for instance, many young women are more likely to have seizures around the time of their menses. And perhaps, that kind of pattern makes itself clear to us if we're kind of tracking it over long term. So identifying trends is very helpful, and also just kind of keeping an actual quantified count of the seizures is really helpful. So again, just with memory issues being what they are, and even I don't have epilepsy, and I don't have the best memory in the world. So when I see somebody every several months and I ask them, how many seizures have you had since last visit? There's a lot of, oh, I think I had 4 or 5. If you have an actual log, we can much better keep track of that over time and see how you've responded to medication changes or other ways to address some of these things that we found to be triggers. So that type of app or other just seizure tracker is another app. Things like that are also really helpful.
Great. Elizabeth, can you talk about any of these technologies that you or any family members have used, and perhaps give a specific example or two of how it impacted your seizure control?
Sure. I had not specifically used any apps, but when I was going through a medication change, I used the notes feature on my phone, and this helped show my care team the results. In the end, that is why we decided to switch towards a neurostimulation path, which has significantly helped me control my epilepsy, which has been encouraging. And also, when I was making the transition to college, technology was a very important part of that. My parents, throughout my time in high school, had helped assure that I took my medications. And I realized that this was not possible for multiple reasons during my college time, partially because since my parents were so far away, it would be arduous if all the time they had to call me and say, "Did you take your meds?" And I did not want to be stuck in that feeling of being a little kid anymore. So I knew I needed to be more responsible. And to deal with that, I set up alarms on my phone for when I needed to take my meds. And with these notifications, I very rarely at this point forget about my meds or also downloading the data from my neurostimulator. And overall, using phone alarms has significantly helped me with managing epilepsy in a more independent sense.
Right, right. And I think that's a really important point, that you don't necessarily need to have a specific app. A lot of times just simply using, if you have a smartphone, the notes section, setting reminders, setting alarms, those types of things can be super helpful. So thanks, Elizabeth. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to share on that topic before we move on?
I think I'll jump in quickly. So I've had some individuals using Epsy. EPSY is an app that should be freely downloadable as well. But a lot of my patients that I've had struggle with the phone tech and the iPad tech to have that and to log it. Usually after a seizure event, there's some disorientation. They don't remember to put it on their phone. But going back, I mean, this is old school. But some of the Excel sheets, we would make those and share with patients on a Google Drive or OneDrive. And that way later on, they'd remember I did have an event. And so I would usually either have an alarm set up on their systems with them to say every day at such a time, please go in, fill out that Excel tracking sheet on Google Drive or whatever option they wanted to use. And then I could get in and see some of that information too. At night, even though it's not directly related to epileptic events, and this would not be anything to do with necessarily diagnosing by any means at all, but even Fitbit data became very useful for me, several years ago when tracking logs for sleep. When are you waking up? How often are you waking up? To know when to talk to the neurologist, or to see if there's more waking episodes or changes in your sleep rhythms. Maybe we're having some more breakthrough events at night too. And that data is really easily accessible for a lot of patients, and a lot have so many smartwatches now that track their sleep. It also gave me another indication of things changing in these patients and when to or not to for seeing functional change in that regard. So just want to throw those other things in.
Right, and possibly not only the seizure or the sleep apps could potentially identify seizures that are happening during the night, but also identify potential sleep deprivation, which could then be a trigger for seizures. So a twofold benefit there. Susan, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, so I echo both old school technology and newer technology. So just having a text from my son if he has a seizure has been helpful. And so when we go to the doctor, at 6 months and, he says that there've been 2 seizures, we have tracking then that says, exactly how many it has been, whether it's 2 or whether it's more or whether it's 0. So that's one way. He voice texts those so that doesn't require him to use the manual dexterity, which is sometimes tough after a seizure. In addition to that, I think that we found Alexa has been helpful. So the Alexa Notes feature, Alexa take a note, and then that's something else he can voice about things. We definitely found the calendaring very, very helpful. But I also echo what Dr. Wolff said, is that Fitbit sleep tracking has gotten much more sophisticated. There's some research studies going on about this, and we found that to be really, really helpful, solving some breakthrough seizures. And also I've recommended it to other patients of ours where they're having some breakthrough seizures, and they know their sleep is disturbed, but they don't really have wrap their hands around how much it's disturbed. It's a good way to at least document it and then figure out, is it certain time of day that you're waking up? Is it something that you can track to, a change in how you're metabolizing things? All those things that can be tracked. It's pretty sophisticated. So I really think that is technology that's going to even be getting better, but even right now, it's something that I do recommend.
Great, great. So technological advances are leading to a growing number of seizure detection and alert devices, and we talked about some of these last night in our webinar. And that can include smartphone apps, watch-like devices, video monitors, and mattress-based detection systems. Dr. Tank, can you talk about the benefits and limitations of such devices?
Yeah, so I certainly have some patients who use some of these devices. The way that most of them work is by detecting abnormal movements, so kind of rhythmic movements. And in that way, they're most helpful in detecting convulsive seizures. So to start off with a limitation, if you're having seizures that don't involve you having convulsive activity, it's unlikely, in general, all these different technologies are unlikely to pick those up. However, they are fairly good at detecting, what we call a generalized tonic-clonic seizure in more, active motor seizures. So they are very good for those sorts of things. I think specific instances where they may be helpful are patients who maybe live in a secluded area of the house or live alone, but near loved ones, and are prone to, for instance, having nocturnal convulsive seizures. Those seizures are particularly concerning to us because that type of seizure is most closely associated with what we call SUDEP, so patients who experience sudden unexplained death from seizures. So for instance, I have patients who use a watch device called an Embrace device. And what that does, again, is it detects those rhythmic motor movements. It's connected to the patient's phone through Bluetooth, and it can then send messages to predetermined loved ones to notify them this patient had, or this person had an episode that seems like it could have been a seizure. So you can check on that person and make sure that they're okay. As you said, there are also mattress alarms, so devices that you put underneath the mattress that, again, kind of detect rhythmic movements. And sometimes it can even be really low amplitude movements. If you set the device to be sensitive enough, it can even detect heartbeat changes. So if you have a rapid acceleration in your heart rate, that may be from seizure, and it can set off a bedside alarm to indicate to somebody else in the home maybe that you should go check on that person. There are also, I believe, some apps, something called Seize Alarm, which I don't have personal experience with, but I've read about it, that works in concert with your Apple Watch, for instance, and again, kind of detects those rapid motor movements and can, again, send messages to loved ones or people nearby who may be able to help. So in those most dangerous types of seizures, there are a lot of different ways to have some kind of backup plan to make sure that they're not going undetected and exposing people to greater risk of SUDEP or other types of injury from that type of seizure.
Okay. Does anyone else have any experience with seizure detection apps or alert devices?
So the recent diagnosis of an elderly family member, he wears an Apple Watch and he was having falls. And there's a fall alert for that you can actually program, and then we noticed that there was a consistency to it, and it did turn out to be seizure activity. In fact, I was there at one point where I watched this happen, and so we put more surveillance on him so that we had an idea what was happening, and so we were able to tie the fall to the fact that that I was watching something happening, and that did turn out to be seizure activity, which is fairly common with dementia, which is what he suffers, even though he's pretty good still. This was activity that could be tracked as seizures.
Great. So Dr. Tank, can you talk, you mentioned SUDEP, but can you talk specifically about how these devices might help to lower the risk of SUDEP? I mean, there's been some suggestion that simply rousing a person after detecting a tonic-clonic seizure can potentially reduce the risk. But can you just talk a little bit more about the specific ways that this can potentially help prevent or reduce the risk of SUDEP?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right there. Just being there to be with the patient may be enough to prevent them from experiencing the kind of prolonged respiratory suppression that may cause SUDEP. SUDEP it's a relatively rare thing in people with epilepsy, but it is a very real risk. And we sadly don't really completely understand the mechanisms of it. So whether it's due to cardiac arrhythmias or just kind of respiratory suppression is not really entirely clear. However, if a patient does have the type of seizure which produces either one of those effects, just to be there with the patient, and if arousing the patient is not enough to kind of stimulate that breathing, getting somebody there just to deliver emergency medical services there should they need it, or you yourself if you need to initiate rescue breathing or CPR or something of that nature before irreparable harm is done. To get that kind of alert in a timely fashion and to get the person attention in that period of time where unsalvageable damage to the brain from not getting blood flow or oxygen has happened is critical. So they can be theoretically and I think in practice very helpful in limiting that risk.
Okay, great. And in addition to the seizure monitor specifically, you mentioned a heart rate monitor as one option. There's also pulse oximeters that measure the oxygen level, apnea monitors that measure breathing. Have you found these to be useful for any particular subset of patients, and can they be used in a practical way, or are there limitations with those as well?
I think that they can be used in a practical way. It's a very interesting question. I haven't thought about whether or not there's a specific subset of patients in which I think that might be most helpful. I would suspect that in patients with kind of pervasive developmental abnormalities, perhaps you might be more likely to benefit from a pulse oximeter alarm or a heart rate alarm or an apnea alarm, just because somebody who has, for instance, really significant cerebral palsy, they may have muscle contractions that prevent the body from demonstrating that kind of convulsive activity that some of these other patients with different types of neurologic baselines may experience during their seizure. So while that may not be detectable by an embrace watch or something like that, the effects on heart rate and breathing certainly can still be in effect. So perhaps in that specific subset of patients, that would be a more useful type of alarm system. There's also, I neglected to mention, but there are also some video monitoring systems where you can place video cameras in the person's bedroom. It connects kind of through wireless technology to an iPod or a smartphone. And again, when it detects kind of abnormal movements, it can alert the patient or the person who's monitoring from a different room with a cell phone or whatever the device is. And that's, in addition to just kind of the more standard types of video camera technologies that are so pervasive now, that's something that's really kind of specifically tailored to epilepsy that's also very helpful. But again, not perfect for every patient, but certainly for a lot of patients.
Okay, great. So now let's discuss the impact that epilepsy can have on memory, executive function, attention, and other cognitive functions. Dr. Wolff and Susan, can you review some of the many ways that assistive technology, smartphones, smart home assistants, and associated apps can help people with epilepsy adapt to cognitive challenges in day-to-day life? Dr. Wolff, do you want to start maybe?
I was going to let Susan jump in.
Okay.
So Susan, I'm going to let you jump in since you have some personal experience with this, and I will fill in gaps very happily thereafter, but why don't I let you jump in first?
Okay.
Oh, you're muted there, Susan.
All right, sorry about that. So I've definitely found we did something unique, at least when my son was in high school. We wrote his iPhone into his IEP. So if your student has an IEP or a 504 plan, it was something that we wanted to do. We wanted him to develop the skills when he was in high school for both medication management as well as some of the other communication things. So we we wrote that in an effort to really integrate it into really what he was doing as part of learning. And that turned out to be pretty really helpful for us. We also found with our elderly family member who has dementia, who's asked the same question fairly often because he'll lose track of time, especially when he's having active seizures. Alexa doesn't mind having the same question asked multiple times. And that actually can be really helpful for a caregiver who that sometimes does wear down caregivers. And so it also is a reminder for caregivers when they're in the mix of doing other things, some reminders that are going on of either to check on people or events or reminders of calendaring. Those are all really, really helpful. Also music, the ability to play music and for the person with dementia, being able to change that. I think that all of us, you know, there are times in our lives where things are going on and we need reminders, but also what I have seen, at least with what's going on now and kind of the isolation that happens with COVID, but social isolation that happens with epilepsy, is there's a lot more things that we can do that keep our brains active in a way that help challenge some of the things that we that support us. So my son, I find him, he searches out new things online. He's been doing 3D printer things. And so those are all things that have been challenging. We found those online and that's kept him challenged and engaged in amongst all this social isolation.
Right, absolutely. So intellectual challenge is really important for quality of life and brain health overall. So technology
and some exercise and some exercises. So there's he does a yoga. So there's a yoga that he does online, adaptive yoga. And those have been really helpful in terms of him feeling engaged. And one of the things they're doing now is they show the other people. It's not just video broadcast, but they show the other people so he can see that other people are doing it. And that helps, again, that group activity. He feels like he's engaged in a community. And I think that that's very helpful as well.
Great. Dr. Wolff?
I'll jump in here. So going along with the Alexa thing, I'm encouraging a lot of individuals to verbally set alarms. So it doesn't just ping, but to say, you know, when this alarm goes off, please remind me. And families can help set that up, whether it's your children, teens, adults, or particularly geriatrics. So when the alarm or the beep goes off, similar to the old watches where you just had an alarm but you didn't know what it was for, we can now use Google Home, Alexa, and so other things to not just have the alarm prompt, but to say, hey, take your meds. So please set alarm for 8 o'clock. With that alarm, verbally remind me to take my medications or something to that effect. So we can multiple pair that technology. Alexa can also be shared with smartphones. So it can be zipped out to make sure if you're a family member and, you know, let's say we have someone that's struggling with medication compliance, it can set an alarm both to your phone and obviously in the home or the residence where that person's at. So you can remember, oh, let me give them a quick call. Did you remember to take your meds? Until these things start to become habit. Because we're not with them and we're away, we hope that the foundations that we may have set up, whether it's, you know, scheduled pill boxes that release pills at a different time, Alexa reminding you, a schedule that you're supposed to go to, something on your smartwatch that you might have, but you still have to actually go do that. And some individuals don't follow through even though they're right there. So we can sync other devices with what's in that home to, again, call, text, prompt, and remind, particularly for medication management. I'm really liking shared apps these days, and a lot of them are out there. Google Calendar, Gmail have done this for a long time. I like Cozy, C-O-Z-I. You can actually have people set up as your family, and you can do things from grocery lists to task lists to prompts, and you can set up reminders. It auto alerts everyone who should be involved in the prompting, who's going to stop by, and it's free if you don't mind pop-up ads. But otherwise, it's like $19 a year, $20 a year. But that way you can invite people into the family. So even potentially speaking, if you had a guardian, your guardian can be looped in, obviously parents, family members. And that way people know what's going on, when it's happening, who is scheduled to double check and to follow through with those types of things. And they're good external reminders, good compliance reminders, and can be very, very helpful too. If something happens then for the epileptic individual, instead of remembering, I got to text 5 people all of a sudden, nope, I can go to that shared app, type in a message, it'll auto alert all of them simultaneously to say something's up. On the cognitive side, when we're looking at cognitive retraining, you know, we've had Luminosity and we've had CogniFit, we've had Posit Science, and there's several out there on the market right now. And I've suggested to patients for a long time, it doesn't hurt to use them. The science is getting better to show that maybe these types of online apps and gaming systems do potentially slow down neurocognitive decline in volumetric studies. But similar to, you know, playing video games in some cases, you might learn some skills and you might improve your cognitive processing speed, but we don't always see those generalize out to the world functioning. And that's the bigger problem that we're still having with, you know, do these memory training games or do these decision-making games really help you function in life to improve better? And we don't have a lot of science still there. That said, we do know it's better than nothing, and it's so imperative to keep our minds healthy. I'm encouraging more and more families, if you can, especially if the individual is somewhat tech savvy, do Zoom games where you can play games together, memory, clue, different things that are going to challenge skill sets from thinking and reasoning. And you can do that now on the free Zoom or, you know, Doxy, or there's so many different options out there, Facebook meetings, that now you don't have to just do isolated games by a computer simulated option. Go ahead and do it together where you can actually challenge each other in vivo and encourage each other to think it through or to remember it more effectively. Is a lot better. You can pick up where a game left off. If you don't have that option, I'm encouraging more patients play online chess against a computer or join an online chess group. But there's chess, there's checkers, there's bridge. You can do a lot of these things with other people online now, which will give you more advancement to the challenge than just a computer simulated option to advance skill or to hold skill. So I am encouraging not just the use of some of the publicized keep your brain sharp apps, but let's go ahead and bring it a little bit more in vivo as well.
Great. Elizabeth, are there any technologies that you or your peers have found particularly helpful in managing or completing your coursework in college? And these don't have to be epilepsy specific, just any kind of apps or technologies that you've found to be helpful.
Yes, I have certainly used technology in a wide variety of ways in order to help with my classes. One of the main things that I started out doing was just using the calendar on both my phone and my computer, because I made events for all of my classes, meetings, clubs, and other activities. And first, that made sure that I did not forget about things, and also then I could see how much time I had left in the day to do other things such as study. And I would divide up this extra time and create a plan for the day, so I could make sure that I was doing things in an appropriate way to use my time. Also, especially this year, I used video conferences to study. I have learned that with the memory issues I have, simply reading over notes again and again doesn't help. So I would video conference my parents, because explaining the content to other people and then having them ask you questions and answering them is a good way to figure out if you understand the content well and to just reinforce your ideas. And I specifically did it with my parents because having people who didn't already know the information because they weren't in the class and didn't have other classes to worry about was a good way to do it. Another thing that I've been working on, especially in harder classes, is taking notes online. I was using Google Docs, but there's lots of ways you can do that. Because my professors were kind enough to put up the PowerPoints on our course webs page before the actual classes. So I would copy down the notes that were on this document, and if then during class I could add the extra comments or notes that the professor made, but I did not try to have to hastily copy down everything. And so I could focus more on the important little information that the professor was giving, and if this or she decided to add anything extra, versus trying to crazily type down everything, since sometimes professors talk very fast.
Great. That's a lot of great tools that you've developed and used. So anyone else want to add anything, any particular technologies that can be particularly helpful in an academic setting?
I think that being able to get the textbooks on audio has been really helpful for my son. We did that as part of a Bookshare plan that he had accessible to him. And most doctors can write a doctor's note for Bookshare. That allowed us to have those textbooks, whatever they were, converted to audio and read for him. And then that, he was able to listen to it chapter by chapter.
Yeah, I think, LiveScribe Pen, we've talked about that a lot. Using your phone to record is a good option. Shared partners taking notes. I've had some students who both part of their IEP, but if there's someone else that they can work with, they know, hey, I can focus pretty good for 15-minute intervals. Why don't I take the first 15, you take the next, compare notes later. There's a lot of good writing apps out there. Milo Writing is one that's out there, and I'm forgetting another really good one right now. It'll have to come back to me in my own memory issue right now. But using some of those writing apps to use the structure so you don't have this idea that you're developing in your mind, trying to write it or type it or talk it fast enough, but you don't quite get it out there, and all of a sudden, oh shoot, it's gone. Use the outlining, use the structure so that you kind of know the way you're feeding into the information. And if you do have an event or if something happens, your ideas are still there. And so I'll think of the other writing app, but those types of things are very useful.
Great. And speaking of technology, if you do think of that writing app, you can just use the chat feature, the handy chat feature, to type it into the chat box, share it with our attendees. So, okay, so people with epilepsy are also at increased risk for depression, anxiety disorders, sleep disorders, physical inactivity, and a variety of other health conditions and symptoms. Fortunately, there are a multitude of wellness-related devices, apps, and websites that can address these problems and enhance quality of life. Can any of you share any such technologies that you or your patients have found particularly helpful?
I can start. I know a lot of patients, as was previously mentioned, have a hard time and I think that just activators in general can be a really nice way for patients to find something to motivate themselves, to set goals, to track how they're doing over time. So whether it's an Apple Watch or just a pedometer or any kind of app just to manually log what you've done that day, I think that those are all great, and I certainly encourage my patients to use those things a lot. Sleep is a very common issue in patients with epilepsy. And there are, besides just kind of the inherent software in a Fitbit or an Apple Watch that tracks your sleep, there are some other apps like Pillow is one, I think Sleep Tracker is another, that can be very helpful in helping you recognize the duration and quality of your sleep, and maybe look for patterns there that may help us identify means of improving your sleep. And then stress, anxiety, all those things are very common in this condition as well. So there are a lot of apps out there to help with meditation or developing other types of tools like that to help you manage your anxiety without necessarily requiring medication or counseling or that sort of thing. So Headspace is a very common one. I have a couple of people who use that and find it to be very helpful. And not only does it help with anxiety, it can help with insomnia and all sorts of other issues. So there are a lot of different available and inexpensive and easy to use tools out there to help with kind of those quality of life things outside of just seizure detection and seizure control. Absolutely.
Great. Anyone else?
Calm is one of the ones that I've seen used, and there's a mindfulness app that I think Dr. Tank has mentioned. Headspaces, which is another one that I've used, and even having some other way to do something when you are coming out of a seizure. So the coloring books, the online coloring books that you can actually color on an iPad. Music is another thing that I've seen used. I think CogniFit is, Dr. Wolff mentioned that, and that's been helpful of being able to keep, especially if you're trying to learn some specific thing, or any of the tools that you can actually put your notes into to keep kind of like drill down on the skills. So being able to test yourself on things. I think that Elizabeth mentioned, just engaging somebody else who can help you with that is another great way of keep going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we also, there's a lot of home-based bio or neurofeedback mechanisms that could be useful on the market these days. We're kind of shying away from some of the neurofeedback options out there just because there's a lot there. It's been a 40-year science, but knowing how to use it, knowing how to train it, knowing what it means, is there value to all levels and extent or not? We're a little bit gun shy there, but like M-Wave through heartmath.com has a good biofeedback mechanism that does track your heart rate, your respiration, and trying to get yourself into coherence so that you know if stress, which is a trigger for a lot of individuals for epileptic response, is a problem and you're starting to get stressed. It's like $100 and it can sync to a smartphone. You get a little finger pulse oximeter. Actually, clip it to your ear. There's a new finger one out there. But you're doing things like that to learn, how do I keep myself in balance and keep myself focused? A lot of the self-meditation stuff is so readily available now. Apple has a whole meditation division, I think, in their platform for both music and walking through things. Headspace, Calm are fantastic options too. So using those for rhythming and for mindfulness and to be tracking, like, when do I need to use these things more often than not? When do I need to build breaks into my day? And start scheduling those so that they're routine and not waiting until you think you're on that brink, but doing them preventively and proactively to keep yourself in balance.
I personally started using a Fitbit last year, which has been very helpful for me, both in staying healthy, such as getting the appropriate amounts of exercise and activity, as I rarely now have days with under the recommended half an hour of exercise and 10,000 steps. And also for me, it's been important in getting the correct amount of sleep, as was discussed earlier, because sleep is so important for controlling my epilepsy and a lot of other people's, and realizing the quality. The fact that being in bed for 8 hours does not mean you are necessarily actually getting 8 hours of sleep. And that helped me adjust the sleep schedules that I used, especially when at college, and realize that, if I have a giant exam tomorrow, probably should go to bed earlier versus trying to study all night. And sometimes just getting a reminder from technology as to what makes the most sense to stay healthy and prepare for things has been very helpful for me. And I have also used the relaxation program on the Fitbit app that has been helpful as well.
Great, great. And I also want to reinforce what Susan mentioned about apps and devices that you can use for creativity purposes. I know we just, right around the COVID start of the crisis, we got a $4 app called Procreate, and it's for an iPad. And it's this super powerful art app with all kinds of tools, and it's great because you can do art, and if you mess up, you just hit undo. And so it's less frustrating for someone who's not necessarily artistic and who wants to dabble in that. And me and my daughter have both gotten lost for hours playing with that. So that's a great way for mindfulness and stress reduction and just enhancing quality of life. And there's things like that for music and other creative pursuits as well. So
I think also
okay,
the online communities. So this may be more for caregivers or for people connecting with other people, but having online communities that you can connect to. There are special ones now for the Dravet community. and making sure that your caregiver is also taking care of themselves and connecting to other people amongst all the hard work of caregiving. It's important to connect with others and have a community in this time where we're kind of distanced and you can't be with community next to one another, still finding a way to connect with community.
Right, right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about telemedicine. That's been instrumental in the delivery of healthcare services during the COVID-19 pandemic. Can each of you briefly summarize how your use of telemedicine changed as a result of this crisis and how you'd like to see it used in the future?
I can say that as this all began, we were, at least at my institution, caught slightly flat-footed, and for a while we had to cancel all outpatient appointments while we really prepared ourselves to kind of rush headlong into telemedicine. I think within a few weeks we kind of have gotten things up to speed, at least for us, and I know that's true of many other places, not just in Michigan, but around the country. Now we're able to offer telemedicine appointments. I see a fair number of my epilepsy patients virtually, and I think that it's a wonderful way to offer care to that specific patient population, knowing that, mobility and the ability to find a ride and have transportation can be so difficult. To be able to see somebody face to face and just kind of talk. So much what we do in epilepsy is just talking. Tell me how you're feeling on your medications. Tell me how many seizures you've had. Face-to-face, in-person encounters not always necessary. And I think that this disorder really lends itself to telemedicine. And I think that's going to continue to expand for us, which is wonderful. I think that another thing that's been really helpful is we have personally started to contract with a company that does in-home EEGs, again, just to kind of help limit the need for people to leave their homes and get necessary testing, and many other places do that as well. So both in terms of just evaluation with physicians and getting testing, I think that we're moving very rapidly towards doing what we can from home to both make it easier for patients and to limit risk. So it's been a wonderful experience so far for us.
And ambulatory EEG, there are now companies that do that with video as well, right?
That is correct. So the company that we've most recently started using, again, kind of goes to the patient's home, whereas previously there were patients were having to come into the hospital to get hooked up and then kind of being sent back to their homes. This company will come to you. They'll have set up a couple of cameras in your home, which makes the ambulatory EEG a much more useful test. Frankly, in the past, something that I've kind of been loath to order because not having that video component just really limits how useful it is. So there are these companies now all over the place, and this kind of testing is readily available, and it's maybe not always the go-to test, but it's often a very good test and gives us the information that we need, and it has a place and it serves that role very well.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll jump in on the neuropsych side. So telebehavioral health has been around a long time, and lots of us would use it intermittently for a long time. Even though we had healthcare that had codes for it and CPT codes, many weren't paying for those CPT codes. So you had the fee structure, you had the CPT, but if you build it, it would end up becoming patient responsibility. So our gun shine, our flat-footedness, I think more on the behavioral health side, was just that. We didn't want families being stuck with bills, even though it was supposedly a coverable benefit. So that changed abruptly where insurances said, hey, at this point in time, anyone can go ahead and use the telehealth CPT codes. And by the way, we're going to pay for them, which opened up that door for a lot of these different services. Teleneuropsychology has become a little bit more dynamic. A lot of our tests were not validated for in-home based modeling. There can be gaps in timing delays. And so if you did have any timing tests, what I say presently might have a 4-second or more loop on their end before they hear what I'm saying. And so if there were some time tests or interval of time change for cognitive processing speed or how fast to talk or present yourself, you lose some data reliability and validity in the interpretation of those things. We also had individuals that we tried early with the teletesting. Some kids were on their phones while they were supposedly doing testing, and even though it looked like they were looking at you, they'd have it propped up against their computer monitor, and they could be pretty savvy. Or other people would be, you know, kind of behind them and giving them answers. We found a couple times. So we haven't been able to get in home-based environment as much structure as we'd like to have for teletesting. If they're in residential centers, hospitals, clinics, I think we have some pretty good and very reliable ways now to reach out, even to remote clinics, to do teleneuropsychology, at least get a pretty good screening battery done so you don't necessarily have to travel long distances. Or if you have other type of structured opportunity where we can do these evals, at least for screening purposes, teleneuropsychology consult for rehab or monitoring and stuff, that I think has been a really easy flow into our systems using Doxy or Zoom, or there's so many platforms. There's over 100 that have, well, 60 developed in the month after COVID onset with at home, 60 new tele-platforms developed. And I'm pretty sure there's probably twice that or more now. So there are options.
So I think we've experienced exactly what Dr. Tank and Dr. Wolff have experienced. I think the flat-footedness, just as Dr. Wolff mentioned, was that you know, a lot of these things were not paid for. And lo and behold, you know, March 11th, all of a sudden there was a genie that said, hey, we're going to pay for them. And we were all grateful for that genie deciding they were going to pay for them, because it allowed us to kind of activate all the things that we knew would benefit not just our patients with epilepsy, but our other patients, in providing services to them in a way that you know, didn't expose them to things that they didn't want to be exposed to, or provided, you know, it in home so that if they couldn't get transportation, this was a much easier way. So I think most of the support groups that I do have all been going online as well. And so there's all those things that we all had to make adjustments for. And, you know, even our art therapy was moved online. And one of the things that I've seen is people are really, really flexible. And a lot of times it was for us as providers to make them at ease. And if they had trouble connecting initially, is to make sure that we had somebody that could help them connect. And once that connection was made, it was pretty easy. And even they thought it was easier than they thought it was going to be. And so, you know, I think we are just at the forefront of this technology. I think that one of the things is, as long as Medicare and Medicaid continues to pay for it, it will allow us to continue to adapt programming and services in order to support people who we've had trouble supporting in the past, especially in rural communities where, you know, they didn't necessarily have access to even broadband or, you know, video or internet that could support video. But that's also changing. A lot of the technology companies, I know Xfinity did this. They actually provided free Xfinity for people who couldn't afford it, because also the schools were using it to provide video services. So all that's super important. And I think that what we need is for it to continue.
And Elizabeth, you had recently had an appointment via telemedicine. How did that go?
Yes, I had an appointment, and that was very positive, especially because with my neurostimulation device, I transfer data once a month over to my doctor and the company that runs the stimulation, and they analyze this. And what was helpful is on the virtual call, they could directly share all of the information with us through the computer, versus how normally all of us are crowded around one little tablet, which can be relatively tricky to share information with. And we could visualize what they were talking about much more easily. Also, since even with having the same amount of a shorter period of time than normal, we were able to share all the same information and still able to discuss the regular changes as we would have. Another benefit was figuring out the proper scheduling in this way, because during the college year specifically, it can be hard to find a time where both my doctor is available and I won't be missing multiple classes. Since I am 2 hours away from the hospital, that can be very challenging. And But this virtual appointment only took half an hour out of my day. And it was a lot easier to fit into my schedule, even though we had the same amount of discussion. It was just not as large of a time commitment as has previously been, and was overall easier to attend. And thinking for the future, when I'm at school, my parents would not have to drive all the way over, pick me up, and then take me to the hospital, which can be another issue. Thinking even farther in the future, I'm planning on staying within the same healthcare system once I make the transition to adult care, but I am not sure when I go off to graduate school if I will be staying in Michigan. So knowing that it would be possible to have these virtual appointments even after I potentially moved away from the state would make me more comfortable with continuing to move forward in the transition towards adult care. So it would be hard to feel like I got everything set up and then find out that, oh, I'm going somewhere else. None of that is going to work anymore.
Those are all great points. All right, so in a recent survey we conducted on social isolation, 45% of respondents with epilepsy indicated that they often or always feel lonely. So one of the things that contributes to that sense of isolation is fear of having a seizure in public and concerns about how others will respond. Fortunately, there are some technologies that can help inform bystanders and medical professionals how to respond if you have a seizure. Susan and Elizabeth, can you highlight any such tools that you've used or are aware of?
Elizabeth, you want to take this? Because I know you have some things that you've used.
Sure, just a second. I've done quite a bit of research on these sort of tools for my job with the Pediatric Epilepsy Project. I personally have not used any of these apps, but I've found a wide variety of those that work. One of the main ones I found was ICE Medical Standard, which you can use to add emergency contact information to your phone. So if responders, for example, check on your phone, they can figure out who to contact. You can also add information about your health conditions, such as the medications you are taking, which can be another way to help responders. Seizure First Aid is another app that I found, which is helpful in providing information for people on how to respond to seizures. And you can include information for the people who could potentially be looking at it. And there's also ways to track your seizures, such as by taking videos or just simply logging them. And if you need to, you can contact seizure hotlines or 911 through that. One more app, which I believe was mentioned earlier, which is Seizure Alarm, can help patients notify emergency contacts, either if they believe they are going to have a seizure, or also if your phone manually detects seizure-like activity.
Or Susan, anything you wanted to add?
Thanks, Elizabeth, because I know that that's been the focus of some of your research for the Pediatric Epilepsy Foundation. I think adding an ICE contact to your phone is one of the things that all of us should do, because you never know when you're going to need, somebody's going to need your contact information. I think that that's a general good recommendation. I think that wearing an alert bracelet or alert necklace is also really, really helpful. And it seems pretty simple, but it's also something that I think people feel there's a stigma with that. But I also think that it's really important for, if rescue personnel are called, that they have an idea what they're working with, because sometimes that can look different depending on what's going on. And so I think that if you're somebody who's at a concert and there's loud music and all of a sudden you have a seizure, are they going to think that there's some other thing at play where it's a drug overdose or something like that? We've certainly heard those stories, and we don't like to hear those stories, but we also know that those are things that can happen. And so putting yourself in a way that people can get the right information is really, really helpful. And if it's on your body, I do know somebody who has a QR code that is imprinted on her wrist that has her updated information, that they can scan the QR code on their phone and get that updated information right from a website that is for emergency personnel. I think that is kind of going to the nth degree. For her, it was super important because of her health issues that didn't just have one thing, but there are three things, and some medication could be very dangerous to her if she was given that. And so that definitely worked for her. And it's actually worked in 2 instances where she did have to have people, download that information for accurate things. And since it's right on her wrist, it's something that people see when they take a pulse or something like that. Beyond that, I think that we're really at the infancy of a lot of the things that I think are going to be helpful. We're moving that way. I think that even a video call for Alexa can make video calls if you have the video call application, or if your Alexa receiver is the video version, and somebody can check on you. It's the other thing is that it can provide that a way to call them directly and then either check on somebody, or it allows some additional independence as well. So having that in place allows somebody who is your backup to support you in a way that you want to be supported.
Right. So great. We have time for like one more question before we move to Q&A, but Dr. Tank, any technology that could provide a seizure forecast for the day? Like, for example, a green light saying it's going to be a low risk of seizure day, or a yellow light for moderate risk, or a red light for high risk. That would be a huge breakthrough in combating the fear and restrictions and isolations that result from epilepsy's unpredictability. Can you talk about any current efforts to develop such a technology and the challenges involved in doing so?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that is something that the epilepsy scientific community is certainly working for in a couple of different ways. There is currently an ongoing study that involves a few different large medical centers in 3 different continents, looking both at different types of technologies to not just look at maybe implantable EEG data, but also other physiologic changes, perhaps heart rate changes, for instance, and what kind of devices may help detect the kind of changes that could predict seizures. And that's something that's ongoing in again, kind of looking at multiple different modalities that may help us recognize physiologic changes that occur before the seizure happens. In a more focused sense, for those who are not familiar with the NeuroPace device or responsive neurostimulation device, what that is certain patients who have medically uncontrolled seizures may have this device implanted where EEG electrodes are put on the surface of your brain or within your brain tissue, and it chronically records EEG information directly from the surface of the brain. And right now there's only one device that I guess is capable of delivering that kind of therapy. And so all of that information is stored in a single database with this company that owns that device. And they've been looking at different, what we call Supra circadian rhythms that patients have. So some patients will come to see me in clinic, for instance, and say, I have a seizure every 3 weeks. That's what it is. I know that it's going to happen that way. And for a while, I think many of us were maybe a little bit skeptical of those claims, because that just seems maybe coincidental, or seems odd to us that your body would have that kind of rhythm to it. But what NeuroPace is finding is that certain patients do certainly have that kind of rhythm and that kind of predilection with their seizures. So they're looking to see how, I guess, broadly applicable that is, and how pervasive those kind of patterns are for patients. And hopefully between those 2 studies and other things that may be going on there, perhaps outside of my awareness, we are able to develop different minimally invasive technologies that can help predict seizures. And if not just allow patients the opportunity to be aware of the possibility of a seizure that day, or a greater possibility, maybe even help us preventatively treat them before they happen at some point down the line. Certainly not close to that now, but that is the dream, certainly.
Right, right. A lot of potential and promise there. So I think we're going to wrap up the panel discussion now, and so we have enough time for Q&A. So again, thank you to all of our panelists for a great discussion. So now we are going to have about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. So any questions that you may have, please just submit those into the Q&A feature, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So let's get started. Looks like we have some questions already. So are there any concerns with entering I'm sorry, I don't understand what this means, PII information in these apps? Is that personal information, personal health information? I'm not sure what PII stands for. Anyone familiar with that term? Oh, you're muted, Susan, sorry.
I read that as pill on my screen only because it's smaller. So I always think it's important to check, no matter what app you're using, it's important to check how they're using the data. Sometimes it's for a medication company. I think that those are still safe. It's just one, how they're using the data, how the data is being stored, what the security protocol is. And specifically on Alexa, there are ways that you can set your Alexa in order to make it more secure. All of those things are important and shouldn't be taken lightly, no matter when it is. It's important to make sure, if you don't know how to set that, that you get some guidance on how to set that, because personal information, especially personal information regarding health, is super important. So, you know, I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but I do think it's important, and it's important to know how that information is being stored.
Right. Okay, another question. As I'm going to read this verbatim. As someone who has had my long-term memory largely erased, it feels effectively like I woke up one morning and the world has simply jumped ahead of me in technology. I'm trying to learn about the last 20 years of tech through observing hundreds of written and video tutorials, but worry the next seizure could undo everything just done, and I need to start again at the beginning. Any good consolidated introduction to technology, or Technology for Dummies 101 that teaches the basics of both tech overall and tech for epilepsy patients specifically, for each time an event like that could recur? So yeah, are there any like good consolidated places where someone can kind of get a Technology 101 for health related conditions like epilepsy that anyone's aware of?
I'm not aware of anything like that. You know, in those situations, each app, or not each app, but some apps, usually if there's a fee for them, will have training tutorials for you. The free ones usually won't, and they tell you what they can be used for. There's sometimes some written up material on how they can be used, and that would be a lot of retraining. But otherwise, choose, you know, the couple apps and the couple functions that you need. Maybe you record yourself, or have a family member record videos for you of how to use those apps, what information was there, so that you have your select, you know, 3 to 5 maybe most functional applications that you have for your own use, and make your own training tutorials in that regard. Or only buy apps that have video tutorials for them. And again, keep them small. Don't have, you know, 10, 20, 30 apps. Keep, you know, very basic for your functional utility, for what's the most optimal for you and your performance, and then either buy the apps that have the videos, or again, make your own for those specific options.
Great answer, yeah. So another person worried about driving a car and having a seizure. Are there any apps that can detect seizures, then turn on the car's emergency or hazard lights, or even bring the car to a stop and alert 911 and other emergency contacts? I think we'll talk about this a little bit on Friday, but is anyone aware of anything now that would do that? Certainly seems like there would be a huge value in that.
Yeah, no, I agree there would. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to
Self-driving
say,
cars are, I think are going to be great for people with epilepsy, or with any illness where, they haven't been able to drive. I think self-driving cars are kind of one of those things that it feels far out, but they're being developed here in Michigan. Even downtown Detroit, is testing them. I still don't think it's the prime time yet. I don't know that there are those that are available for the average consumer to use. I think that technology or that deep learning, the AI interface is still being developed. But we have some really smart people. University of Pennsylvania is kind of at the forefront of doing this. They have brain drivable interfaces for wheelchairs now that are, we have 2 people in Michigan who actually have that. So all of that stuff is really at the forefront, and it's deep learning, and that is somewhat individual for people, especially with medical conditions. But at some point, that will be some information that we can exploit and be able to use for individuals. I just don't think it's there yet.
yeah, I was going to jump on that too. Sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Tang. Cars aren't there yet by the technology that I know of that we have. Pet assisted, if you are, let's say you've been seizure free for 6 months, a year, or potentially more, and you're thinking, I want to get out there, but being in that vehicle, one might be stress, or the way the sun hits off the dashboard when you're driving, or different things might provoke, then you might want to, your best case scenario would be to have a therapy animal trained in the detection of possible metabolic change to detect with you as you start driving, to hopefully flag like, whoa, put a paw on me or something. You're about to have an event, trust that, take that break, call to get someone else to come pick you up or something. But no, to my knowledge, it's not there yet. Dr. Tank?
You're muted, Dr. Tank.
Sorry. Yeah, agreed. As I mentioned before, the scientific community is certainly looking into different ways to predict this, but unfortunately not there yet. That would be a wonderful thing if and when it comes to fruition, but sadly, to my knowledge, nothing like that exists.
Okay. And a quick clarification question for Susan. The QR code that you mentioned, what was it located on? It is on a bracelet, on a Fitbit?
So it can be located on a bracelet, or on a health information device. That way, it's not information that general people are going to know. It just is a QR code, but it's on a necklace so that it's something that can be scanned. This particular person actually had it tattooed on her so that it wasn't something that she would lose or forget to put on. She just took it as the next step, as that there's no way that that's going to be, it's going to change because it's on my wrist, and it's information that served her very well. There is a website that you can use. It's if you Google QR code for health issues, it is something that it's a service. It's very simple. You can actually set it up on your own, so that there is, first of all, it's password protected. There is unique passwords that safety people use for those sorts of things to unlock things. Maybe talk to one of your EMTs about that, because I do know that that's something when they go into your ICE information that can also be put into your ICE information. They have a way of unlocking it.
Okay, great. And related question to that is there a good app for medical alert on your smartphone to lock on your home screen when you're away? So the lock screen, you can use an app for that, or couldn't you just take a picture of something too and have that be your lock screen? So there's a few different ways you could do that, right?
Yeah, and I think that that's smart. I think that that's really smart. Even having a rescue information of somebody to call, I think that that's a very smart way to do it. There are, I've seen apps where you can actually do that. It allows you to put a picture along with it so that, it's somewhat traditional in that it has a photo on there or a background screen. But, I don't know that you need a specific app. I think that you just need to have that information and merge it into a photo and have that on there.
Right. Okay. Someone was asking about their daughter is planning on going to missions in other countries, and do these apps work in other countries? I mean, are any of them not supported overseas? And then also, specifically her daughter sees an epileptologist at Spectrum Health. Does Spectrum Health work with patients' doctors in other countries, or does telemedicine work in other countries? Dr. Tank, is that something that a doctor would be able to have telemedicine or keep in touch with the patient overseas?
Yeah, it should be able to. I'll be honest, I don't know of a specific patient thus far who we have managed from abroad via telemedicine, but the interface, it just requires an internet connection. So as long as there's internet connection available, it should be able to work. I can't imagine any reason that there would be a firewall issue or something else that should prevent that from happening. In terms of the apps, I don't have an intimate knowledge of all of them, but for the most part, there's something that's installed on your phone. It's a piece of software that's integrated into your phone. So I can't think of a reason why it shouldn't work abroad.
So during COVID, we had a student that was in China who is one of our patients and who was managed from abroad for the COVID situation. And she also had, another illness that needed to be managed and medication titrated along with, what they were trying to treat her for. She was in the hospital in China for close to 3 weeks. And so we did manage her from over there. And that was one thing that her parents who were here stateside were very nervous about, making sure that, all of her health information. This would have been helpful for some of the health information to be online for them to be able to share that. Health information systems aren't the same in other countries, but even having some information that was available on a website would have been helpful for this individual. I think that family, that's something that they're planning on doing, mainly because websites are available internationally. You don't have to be within a country, although China specifically does screen some websites, so access is something that's not equal for countries that don't have democratic values that they do control access. She was at a university. She was able to get her information through the university. They were able to give her a little bit more access on her phone.
Right, and this very this webinar that we're having now is proof that people can participate internationally. We have someone from British Columbia, and I know we had people from several other countries who registered. So yeah, I think that's most people should be able to access healthcare and other resources internationally. Another person asked, could the VNS help with seizures? And we certainly know that that's the case. But maybe as a follow-up or in addition to that question, is there anything in particular with VNS that might be integrated or a technology that you added to VNS to help with seizure detection and alert or something along those lines?
So I'm going to pipe in here, and I jumped you, Dr. Tank. I'm sorry. So my vision at some point in time here is we get to technology that can monitor for seizure onset or risk of possible seizure onset, similar to what we're having in our diabetes market, where we have the monitors and we have the pumps, but the monitors and the pumps don't always talk together with each other very well at all. As the technology comes into being able to preemptively identify, you might be at risk for a seizure right now, can we then integrate a medication administration system, not a full dose, because hopefully this is preemptive prophylactic to stop the event, not to stop status epilepticus, that a low dose of some type of prophylactic intervention would come into play with a monitoring system. I have read no studies or research currently in the market that's even in that developmental phase. We first have to, like Dr. Tank has said, get to the technology to identify the seizures. From there, then we can maybe get to, can we use the medication that you have on board as a prophylactic dose to stop something from happening so that you keep functioning within your day? And I'll stop interrupting Dr. Tank now, I'm sorry.
No worries. No, I don't have anything to add. I believe that's exactly correct. In the current state, while VNS is certainly a helpful therapy, I don't think it has the capability to help predict seizures, and I don't think it can work necessarily synergistic with any other forms of technology to help predict seizures. But perhaps that is something that LivaNova has designs on working on in the future, and that would be wonderful. But as of now, no.
I certainly think there's a lot of potential to add to both VNS and RNS and DBS as well, to use some of that, for NeuroPace, the ones that are, use some of the data that they're collecting to, work on seizure prediction, but also, seizure detection, some sort of alarm or alert that can go tie in with a smartphone and alert someone to a seizure. That certainly seems like a possibility, and hopefully something like that might happen. So we are out of time, so I will thank everyone again. Thank you, Dr. Tank, Dr. Wolff, Elizabeth, and Susan for an outstanding discussion. And I'm going to hand it off to Brianna to close it out. So thanks again.